The conversation we are about to have is uncomfortable, not because it is exaggerated or extreme, but because it forces people to look at patterns that are already in motion and ask where they lead when no one intervenes. Across multiple countries, across different cultures, and across very different political systems, the relationship between men and women is changing in ways most people are not prepared to acknowledge. What looks like silence on the surface is actually a withdrawal, and what looks like apathy is, in many cases, a calculated exit. If you stay until the end of this video, you will understand why this shift is accelerating and why reversing it may no longer be possible. What we are witnessing right now is not a rebellion, not a protest, and not a sudden emotional reaction. It is something colder, slower, and far more consequential. It is men quietly opting out of participation, opting out of engagement, opting out of systems that no longer reward them for contributing. South Korea has become one of the clearest case studies of this phenomenon, not because its men are uniquely angry or hostile, but because they listened very carefully to what they were told and then complied in the most literal way possible. That compliance has reshaped dating, work, media, public life, and even basic social interaction. For years, South Korean men were told that their presence was unwanted, their interest was intrusive, and their behavior was inherently suspect. They were told that asking a woman out repeatedly constituted harassment, even if the requests were polite, even if the intent was unclear, even if the interaction was something as benign as inviting a coworker for coffee. When policies were proposed to limit how many times a man could express interest before facing consequences, men did not protest. They did not riot. They did not organize mass opposition. They agreed. They accepted the rules exactly as written and adjusted their behavior accordingly. What followed was not increased harmony or improved trust. What followed was silence. Men stopped asking women out entirely because the cost of misunderstanding was too high. They stopped initiating conversations that could be misinterpreted. They stopped taking social risks that offered no upside. Dating did not become safer or more respectful. It simply vanished for a large portion of the population. The game ended, not with an argument, but with one side walking away from the table. The same pattern emerged in the workplace. Women in South Korea argued that men were gatekeeping advancement, that informal mentorship favored men, and that opportunities were distributed unfairly. Men responded by agreeing. They acknowledged the criticism and then removed themselves from any role that could be interpreted as favoritism. They stopped mentoring women. They stopped advocating for them. They stopped offering guidance or informal support. Instead, they competed openly and ruthlessly on measurable output alone. If a woman could outperform a man, she advanced. If she could not, she did not. There was no protection, no assistance, no accommodation, and no apology. This was not framed as punishment. It was framed as equality. Men simply treated women as direct competitors and nothing more. The result was not empowerment, but isolation. Without informal networks, without mentorship, without advocacy, many women found themselves stalled. The very social mechanisms that had quietly supported advancement were removed in the name of fairness, and what remained was a system that rewarded only raw performance in environments already optimized for men. The same ruthless compliance extended into media and culture. When feminist groups criticized Korean television dramas and comedy for playful banter, flirtation, or edgy humor between men and women, men once again agreed. They supported the removal of such content in the name of respect and equality. Writers stripped shows of anything that could be construed as suggestive or provocative. The result was media that was technically inoffensive but emotionally hollow. Men who had already been drifting away from these shows abandoned them entirely. Women were left with content designed for them, funded by them, and watched almost exclusively by them, yet stripped of the elements that once made it engaging. This pattern repeats because it follows a simple rule. When men are told that their presence is the problem, the solution they choose is absence. They do not argue over intent. They do not plead their case. They remove themselves. Over time, This absence compounds. It reshapes entire industries, social norms, and economic systems. What makes South Korea especially important is not that it is unique, but that it is early. The same dynamics are now visible in Japan, China, the United States, and much of Europe. Birth rates are collapsing, not because women refuse to have children, but because men are refusing to participate in relationships altogether. By 2030, nearly half of women in the United States between the ages of 25 and 44 are projected to be single and childless. When single mothers are included, that number climbs dramatically. These figures are not driven by ideology, they are driven by behavior. Men are not protesting feminism, they are complying with it. They are accepting its premises and acting accordingly. If approaching women is risky, they stop approaching. If helping women is framed as bias, they stop helping. If shared spaces become hostile, they leave those spaces. The outcome is not conflict, the outcome is separation. This separation is not limited to dating, it extends into public life. In South Korea, even minor complaints about behavior in shared spaces have been met with strict compliance. When issues like taking up too much space on public transport were raised, men supported rules limiting how much room anyone could occupy. They then altered their schedules to avoid peak hours altogether, arriving early to work, leaving late, and minimizing contact. When forced to use public transport during busy times, they stood quietly and reported violations without confrontation. The system functioned exactly as designed, but the social fabric thinned. This is what ruthless compliance looks like. It is not loud, it is procedural. It uses the language of fairness to justify withdrawal. Over time, women began to notice not hostility, but absence. Men were no longer present in the ways they once were. They were not chatting, not flirting, not offering help, not initiating contact. They were there physically, but socially invisible. Globally, the same withdrawal is accelerating. Men are opting out of mixed gender spaces online and offline. Entire media ecosystems now exist exclusively for men. Content that once focused on finance, gaming, or self improvement has evolved to address male specific experiences because the audience demanded it. Men are building parallel systems that do not rely on approval, validation, or participation from women. At the same time, dating dynamics have become increasingly asymmetric. Most men are single, most young women are not because relationships are healthier, but because a small percentage of men are being shared across large groups of women. This concentration creates instability. As those men exit the market or opt for alternatives, the system collapses quickly. There is no bench, there is no replacement. The majority of men have already left. Technology accelerates this divide. Artificial intelligence is rapidly reshaping and entertainment, companionship, and even intimacy. Men are forming attachments to digital alternatives that offer predictability, respect, and emotional safety. This is not framed as ideal, but as preferable to constant risk. At the same time, entire industries built around female attention are facing disruption. Platforms that relied on male spending are being automated. Men no longer need to engage socially to access a stimulation or connection. The incentive to tolerate risk diminishes further. Economically, the implications are profound. Men pay the majority of taxes. Women drive the majority of consumer spending. As men reduce work hours, avoid high stress careers, and adopt minimalist lifestyles, tax revenue declines. Governments strain under the weight of programs that assumed male participation would remain constant. The social contract phrase: when the state becomes the primary provider and the state struggles financially, there is no fallback. And men respond to this uncertainty by becoming more self sufficient. They invest in skills, trades, decentralized work, digital assets, and local networks that do not require institutional approval. Bartering replaces formal exchange. Trust is localized. Women find themselves excluded not by policy, but by preference. Men choose who they trade with, they choose who they help. Increasingly, they choose other men, and this exclusion is not announced, it is not debated, it simply happens. When services are scarce, prices rise. When trust is limited, access narrows. When men do engage professionally with women, they often do so at a premium, not out of malice, but out of risk calculation. The same rules apply to everyone. The difference is that men have stopped absorbing costs on behalf of others, and social spaces feel the impact. Restaurants lose revenue as men stop dating. Gyms lose members as men avoid environments they perceive as hostile. Bars and clubs hollow out as men stop attending. These businesses were sustained by male spending. Without it, they fail. The cultural narrative focuses on changing tastes, but the underlying cause is withdrawal. As artificial intelligence displaces jobs, this divide widens. Men pivot quickly, adopting new tools, learning new systems, and forming new networks. Women, who are encouraged to consume rather than build, face a harsher adjustment. Debt rises, support systems weaken, the expectation that men will return and stabilize the system persists, but the incentive does not. When men want companionship, they increasingly look elsewhere. They travel to countries where social dynamics are different, where expectations are clearer, and where their contributions are valued. The economic imbalance amplifies this trend. What looks like escape is often simply optimization. Men go where the cost benefit calculation makes sense. This is not a moral argument, it is a behavioral one. Systems that punish participation eventually lose participants. South Korea shows what happens when men take rules at face value and act accordingly. The rest of the world is following, not because of ideology, but because incentives align. We are only at the beginning of this shift. The consequences will unfold over decades, not months. Institutions built on assumptions of male engagement will struggle. Social narratives will lag behind reality. Many people will search for someone to blame. But the pattern remains consistent. When men are told to go away, eventually they do. And once they leave, they rarely come back. Men are not unsure of what to do. They have assessed the environment, weighed the risks, and made a rational decision to reduce exposure. This is why attempts to shame, guilt, or pressure men back into participation consistently fail. Those tactics assume men are emotionally conflicted. They are not. They are resolved. When people ask why men are no longer dating, marrying, or even socializing the way they used to, they often search for a single cause. They blame economic pressure, housing costs, social media, or technology. Those factors matter, but they are not the core issue. The core issue is trust. Trust that intentions will not be misinterpreted. Trust that effort will not be punished. Trust that contribution will be valued rather than resented. Once trust erodes, withdrawal becomes the safest option. In South Korea, this erosion happened quickly because institutional changes were explicit. Laws and policies formalized suspicion. The margin for error disappeared. Men did not need to guess where the boundaries were. They were clearly defined, and the penalties were clear. In response, men did not push those boundaries. They stayed well away from them. Over time, staying away became a habit. Then it became a norm. What followed was not a renegotiation of gender relations, but a silent restructuring of society. Men reorganized their lives around minimal exposure. They focused on work that could be done independently. They prioritized hobbies that did not require mixed gender participation. They invested in skills that increased self reliance. This was not framed as ideology, it was framed as practicality. This practicality extends into friendships. Many men no longer maintain female friendships, not because they dislike women, but because ambiguity carries risk. Friendly gestures can be reinterpreted. Emotional support can be misconstrued. Silence is safer than misunderstanding. Over time, Social circles become more homogeneous, not by exclusion, but by selection. This selection effect compounds. As men withdraw, women experience fewer organic interactions. They rely more heavily on digital platforms which amplify competition and distort perception. Small number of men receive the majority of attention. Those men have no incentive to commit. The majority of men receive none and see no incentive to try. The system feeds itself. The response from institutions is often to double down on messaging. Campaigns encourage men to open up, to engage, to participate responsibly. But these messages fail because they ignore incentives. Men are being asked to re enter systems that still punish mistakes and offer little reward. Without structural change, messaging is irrelevant. At the same time, economic pressures amplify withdrawal. Men increasingly choose jobs that offer autonomy rather than status. They work fewer hours not out of laziness, but because additional income no longer translates into improved quality of life. Without family formation, consumption drops, needs simplify. The incentive to climb corporate hierarchies diminishes. This has macroeconomic consequences that are only beginning to surface. Governments rely on a tax base built around male productivity and female consumption. When men reduce output and women reduce spending due to financial strain, the entire model destabilizes. Social programs strain budgets, debt increases, inflation erodes trust further. The cycle accelerates. In response, men seek systems that operate outside traditional structures. Decentralized finance, peer to peer services, informal trade networks, and skill based exchange grow quietly. These systems prioritize reliability over inclusivity. Participation is earned through contribution. Trust is personal, not institutional. Women are not formally excluded, but participation requires alignment with norms that many are unfamiliar with or unwilling to adopt. This creates a perception gap. Women often interpret exclusion as hostility. Men interpret withdrawal as neutrality. The difference lies in expectation. Women expected continued engagement. Men expected the freedom to disengage. When those expectations collide, resentment grows. Media narratives struggle to keep up because they are built on outdated assumptions. Stories frame men as failing, retreating, or being left behind. But the data increasingly shows the opposite. Single men report higher savings, lower stress, and greater autonomy. They may lack traditional markers of success, but they have optimized for stability rather than validation. This optimization extends globally. When men travel abroad and form relationships elsewhere, it is often framed as exploitation or escape. In reality, it is alignment. Now, men go where expectations are clear and reciprocal, where effort is met with appreciation rather than suspicion, where roles are negotiated rather than litigated. As artificial intelligence continues to reshape labor markets, this divide will widen. Jobs that reward collaboration and communication are increasingly automated. Jobs that reward technical skill and independent problem solving persist. Men disproportionately occupy the latter. As a result, men adapt more quickly to disruption. Women face a steeper transition. Education systems exacerbate this. Boys disengage early, sensing that institutions do not cater to their learning styles or reward their strengths. Many leave formal education altogether and pursue alternative paths. These paths are often invisible to policymakers, but they are effective. Skills are learned through apprenticeship, online communities, and practice rather than credentials. Women, meanwhile, are encouraged to pursue credentials that may not translate into economic resilience. Debt accumulates. Expectations remain high. When outcomes fall short, Blame is externalized. The gap between expectation and reality fuels frustration. Social cohesion suffers as shared experiences disappear. Men and women occupy different spaces. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. Consume different media and pursue different goals. Without shared narratives, misunderstanding grows. Attempts to bridge the gap often rely on moral appeals rather than structural reform. These appeals fail because they do not address root causes. The uncomfortable truth is that many of the changes people want cannot be achieved through persuasion. They require renegotiation of risk, responsibility, and reward. Men will not re enter systems that treat them as liabilities. They will not volunteer for roles that expose them to disproportionate consequences. They will not sacrifice autonomy for promises of future stability that are no longer credible. This does not mean cooperation is impossible. It means it must be rebuilt on different terms. Trust must be restored through consistent incentives, not slogans. Boundaries must be clear and fair. Contribution must be valued without suspicion. Until that happens, withdrawal remains rational. In South Korea, the effects are now visible at every level of society. Birth rates are at historic lows. Social services strain under demographic imbalance. Cultural industries stagnate. The response has been slow because the causes are politically inconvenient. Acknowledging male withdrawal challenges dominant narratives. The same pattern is emerging elsewhere. In the United States, men delay or avoid marriage. In Europe, fertility declines. In Japan, entire towns hollow out. These are not isolated phenomena, they are connected by the same underlying logic. As this logic spreads, new norms emerge. Singlehood becomes normalized. Childlessness loses stigma. Communities reorganize around interest rather than families. This is not inherently negative, but it represents a profound shift from previous models. The danger lies in denial. Systems built for a world that no longer exists cannot function indefinitely. Policies that assume male participation will return through encouragement alone are doomed to fail. Without addressing why men left, there is no path back. Political participation changes first. Men who feel detached from family formation, long term community planning, or shared social futures lose interest in outcomes that primarily benefit those structures. Voting becomes sporadic or symbolic. Civic engagement drops. The emotional bond between individual effort and collective reward weakens. This does not look like radicalization, it looks like indifference. Indifference is far more dangerous to systems than anger because it cannot be redirected or negotiated with. When men disengage politically, policymaking skews further toward the preferences of groups that remain highly engaged. This creates feedback loops. Policies increasingly reflect the interests of women and older demographics, reinforcing the perception among men that the system is not designed for them. Each new policy framed as protection or inclusion is interpreted not in isolation, but as another signal that male participation is optional at best and suspect at worst. The gap widens quietly. Economic behavior follows the same pattern. Men who do not see a future involving family responsibility adjust their risk tolerance. They are less likely to take on debt, less likely to pursue high status but high stress careers, less likely to overconsume. This makes them resilient in downturns, but invisible in growth models that rely on spending. Economies optimized for consumption struggle when large segments of the population prioritize saving and self sufficiency instead. This is why traditional stimulus measures fail to revive engagement. Offering consumption incentives to people who deliberately avoid consumption does not change behavior. Lower interest rates do not motivate borrowing among those who do not desire leveraged lifestyles. Housing incentives do not appeal to men who have opted out of traditional domestic arrangements. The policy tools are misaligned with the psychology of the population they are meant to influence. As men continue to disengage, informal economies grow. Skills are exchanged directly. Trust is built through repeated interaction rather than credentials. These networks are efficient but opaque. They do not show up in GDP calculations. They are not easily regulated. They operate below the surface of official statistics. Policymakers interpret stagnation where adaptation is actually occurring. Women experience this shift differently. Many were socialized to expect stability through institutional pathways, education, career progression, social safety nets, and consumer participation were framed as sufficient substitutes for traditional support structures. As these systems strain, women find themselves exposed. The assumption that the state would replace informal support networks proves optimistic at best. This creates a growing divergence in resilience. Men who have simplified their lives and built decentralized support systems adapt more easily to disruption. Women who remain embedded in consumption driven models feel increasing pressure. This is not because women are less capable, but because the systems they were encouraged to trust are less flexible. Social narratives struggle to address this reality because acknowledging it requires revisiting foundational assumptions. It requires asking whether policies intended to protect have inadvertently discouraged participation. It requires asking whether equality defined as identical treatment produces identical outcomes in environments shaped by biological and behavioral differences. These questions are uncomfortable and politically risky. As a result, public discourse often focuses on symptoms rather than causes. Loneliness is discussed without addressing withdrawal. Economic anxiety is discussed without addressing disengagement. Declining birth rates are discussed without acknowledging male opt out. Each issue is treated as separate, even though they share the same root. Cultural responses tend to oscillate between nostalgia and blame. Nostalgia for a past that cannot be recreated. Blame directed at technology, capitalism, or vague social forces. Rarely is agency acknowledged. Rarely is the possibility entertained that men have made a rational decision based on available incentives. This reluctance to acknowledge agency leads to policy misfires. Programs attempt to coax men back through messaging campaigns or symbolic gestures. These efforts fail because they do not alter the underlying risk calculus. Men are not unaware of social expectations, they are unconvinced that compliance benefits them. At the same time, attempts to enforce participation through regulation often backfire. Restrictions on speech, behavior, or association reinforce perceptions of hostility. Men respond not by pushing boundaries, but by retreating further. Each new rule reduces the incentive to engage. The system tightens and participation declines. In countries like South Korea, this dynamic is already entrenched. Younger men grow up observing older men who have withdrawn and are visibly stable. They learn early that engagement carries cost without guarantee. Withdrawal becomes the default strategy rather than the fallback. By the time policymakers react, the culture has already shifted. The international dimension amplifies this trend. Men are no longer constrained by geography. Remote work, digital finance, and global mobility allow them to relocate or reallocate resources with minimal friction. If one society becomes inhospitable, alternatives exist. This mobility undermines the leverage of national policies. Governments compete not only for capital, but for participation. Women, by contrast, often remain geographically anchored due to social ties, caregiving roles, or institutional dependencies. This asymmetry increases vulnerability. As men leave physically or economically, local systems lose contributors while retaining dependents. The imbalance strains public resources and social cohesion. Media representations often invert this reality, portraying men as dependent or failing. This misalignment between narrative and experience deepens distrust. Men disengage not only from institutions, but from discourse itself. They stop trying to correct the record. Silence becomes easier than argument. Over time, parallel cultures emerge. Men develop their own norms, humor, values, and priorities. These cultures are not necessarily hostile to women, but they are indifferent. Indifference is interpreted as rejection. The emotional distance grows. This distance affects younger generations most profoundly. Boys raised in environments where male disengagement is normalized receive fewer positive models of cooperative participation. They learn self reliance early. They are less inclined to invest in systems that their mentors avoid. The cycle perpetuates. Education systems feel this impact acutely. Male underperformance and dropout rates increase, not because boys lack ability, but because the perceived payoff diminishes. Credentials lose appeal when pathways lead to unstable or adversarial environments. Alternative routes gain legitimacy. As this happens, social stratification increases. A small number of highly engaged men thrive within traditional systems. The majority operate outside them. Women increasingly compete for access to that small group, reinforcing inequality. The gap between expectation and reality widens. The emotional toll of this mismatch manifests as frustration and confusion. Women are told they are empowered, yet feel unsupported. Men are told they are privileged, yet feel constrained. Both narratives coexist uneasily, each validated within its own echo chamber. Resolving this tension requires more than policy adjustment. It requires redefining social contracts in ways that acknowledge mutual vulnerability and shared responsibility. That process has not begun in earnest. Instead, societies drift, hoping inertia will sustain them. But inertia favors withdrawal. It favors simplicity over complexity. It favors systems that require less trust. Unless incentives change, disengagement will continue to spread. As men withdraw from long term relationships, traditional family formation declines. This is often framed as a lifestyle choice or a cultural preference, but it is better understood as an outcome of the incentives. Commitment requires trust in future returns. When men no longer trust that investment in a partner will lead to stability, continuity, or mutual support, they rationally avoid it. This does not mean men reject intimacy or connection. It means they seek it in forms that do not expose them to irreversible risk. The result is the rise of non traditional households, single men living alone or with other men. Informal communities organized around shared interests rather than shared bloodlines. Temporary partnerships without long term obligation. These arrangements are flexible and adaptive, but they lack the intergenerational continuity that families once provided. Children become less common. When they do exist, they are often raised in fragmented environments with fewer male role models. As women experience this fragmentation differently. Many still desire family formation and long term partnership, but the pool of willing participants shrinks. Expectations shaped by previous generations collide with the reality that no longer supports them. The messaging women receive emphasizes independence and self sufficiency, yet the lived experience often involves isolation and financial pressure. The gap between narrative and reality widens. Attempts to address declining family formation often focus on surface level solutions, financial incentives for marriage or childbirth, public campaigns promoting relationships. These efforts consistently underperform because they do not address why men disengaged in the first place. Incentives that do not mitigate risk are insufficient. Encouragement without structural change is noise. At the same time, legal frameworks governing relationships remain largely unchanged. Marriage laws, custody arrangements, and financial obligations still reflect assumptions of mutual trust and shared risk that no longer exist. Men are acutely aware of these asymmetries. They see examples of outcomes where effort does not guarantee security. They internalize caution as wisdom, and this caution is passed down culturally. Younger men observe older men who have disengaged and appear stable, even content. They see fewer examples of men who fully committed and benefited proportionally. The lesson is implicit but powerful. Engagement is optional. Withdrawal is viable. As family formation declines, socialization patterns change. Children raised primarily by single parents or institutions receive fewer examples of cooperative adult partnership. This shapes expectations early. Boys learn independence. Girls learn reliance on external systems. Both learn less about negotiation, compromise, and mutual obligation. These skills erode not because people reject them, but because they are no longer practiced consistently. Communities adapt unevenly. Some neighborhoods hollow out as families disappear. Schools close or consolidate. Local businesses struggle without stable customer bases. Other areas reconfigure around transient populations, short term rentals, and flexible workspaces. The rhythm of life changes. Stability gives way to fluidity. Fluidity has advantages. It allows rapid adaptation. It accommodates diverse lifestyles, but it also undermines long term planning. Infrastructure projects become harder to justify. Social bonds weaken. The sense of shared fate diminishes. When people do not expect to be in the same place in 5 or 10 years, investment in community declines. This is particularly evident in urban centers. Cities once thrived on dense networks of relationships and shared routines. As men withdraw from dating and family formation, urban life becomes more transactional. Interactions are brief, purposeful, and impersonal. Convenience replaces connection. Services replace relationships. Women often bear the emotional cost of this transition more acutely. Social networks that once provided support through partnership become thinner. Reliance on friends increases, but those friends face similar pressures. Institutional support attempts to fill the gap, but it lacks intimacy. Loneliness becomes more common, even as independence is celebrated. Men experience a different emotional landscape. Withdrawal brings relief from conflict and expectation. Solitude becomes normalized. Emotional needs are met through hobbies, online communities, or structured interactions that do not carry ambiguity. While this reduces stress, it also limits exposure to emotional growth that comes from sustained partnership. The trade off is accepted consciously. As these patterns solidify, intergenerational transmission accelerates. Children raised in environments where disengagement is normal are less likely to challenge it. They adapt expectations early. The idea of lifelong partnership becomes abstract rather than aspirational. This is not framed as loss, it is framed as realism. Institutions attempt to intervene through education and social programs. Relationship counseling is offered earlier. Emotional literacy is emphasized. These efforts are well intentioned but often misaligned. They focus on skills without addressing incentives. Teaching communication does not restore trust if structural risks remain unchanged. The economic implications of declining family formation are profound. Families historically pooled resources, shared housing costs, and provided unpaid labor in the form of caregiving. As families shrink, these efficiencies disappear. Living costs rise. Demand for paid services increases. Governments and markets attempt to fill the gap, but at higher cost. Men respond by further simplifying lifestyles, smaller living spaces, fewer possessions, greater mobility. This reinforces withdrawal from consumption driven economies. Women, who often face higher living costs due to caregiving roles or social expectations, experience greater financial strain. Inequality widens not only between genders, but within them. Cultural narratives struggle to reconcile these outcomes with ideals of progress. Empowerment rhetoric persists even as lived experiences become more constrained. Dissonance grows. Public debate becomes polarized. Each side speaks past the other, anchored in different realities. Attempts to revive traditional family models without addressing underlying trust deficits are unlikely to succeed. Nostalgia cannot substitute for incentives. Policies that assume cooperation without rebuilding confidence will fail. The challenge is not persuading people that families matter. Most already know that. The challenge is making partnership rational again. This requires confronting uncomfortable truths about risk distribution, accountability, and mutual obligation. It requires acknowledging that equality defined solely as identical treatment may not produce fairness in practice. It requires redesigning systems that currently reward disengagement over participation. Until such changes occur, adaptation will continue along existing lines. Men will prioritize autonomy. Women will seek stability through institutions. Families will become rarer. Communities will fragment. None of this happens overnight. It unfolds gradually, often unnoticed, until thresholds are crossed. Technology does not create these shifts, but it accelerates them by removing friction and lowering dependency. Where men once needed physical proximity, shared institutions, and social approval to meet basic needs, technology now offers alternatives that are predictable, customizable, and low risk. This does not mean these alternatives are superior in a human sense, but they are often preferable in a cost benefit sense. That distinction matters because human systems do not collapse due to moral decline. They collapse when incentives misalign. Digital platforms have fundamentally altered how people assess one another. Dating apps reduce individuals to metrics, images, and brief descriptions. For a small number of men, this system concentrates attention and opportunity. For the majority, it delivers repeated rejection or invisibility. Over time, exposure to these outcomes shapes self perception and behavior. Men who see no return on effort stop investing effort. This is not bitterness, it is adaptation. Women experience these platforms differently. Abundance of attention creates the illusion of choice, but it also concentrates competition. The same men appear repeatedly across matches, messages, and encounters. Commitment becomes rare, not because men avoid it universally, but because the men with options have no incentive to limit them. The platform architecture rewards novelty over stability. Long term outcomes suffer as a result. Artificial intelligence deepens this divide. Companionship, entertainment, and even emotional validation can now be simulated without negotiation or risk. Men who value peace and predictability find these tools appealing, not as replacements for human connection, but as buffers against loneliness. When alternatives meet basic needs without exposing users to accusation or loss, re entering high risk social environments becomes less attractive. The labor market undergoes a parallel transformation. Jobs that require emotional labor, interpersonal negotiation, or symbolic authority are increasingly automated or restructured. Jobs that reward technical competence, independent problem solving, and system design remain valuable. Men disproportionately occupy these roles not by conspiracy, but by preference shaped through years of disengagement from social reward systems. Remote work accelerates this trend. Men no longer need to embed themselves in office cultures that demand performative social engagement. They can contribute output without navigating interpersonal politics. This reduces stress and increases efficiency, reinforcing the decision to disengage from traditional workplace dynamics. Women, who often rely more heavily on relational networks for advancement, find these environments less navigable. Education systems struggle to adapt. They emphasize collaboration, discussion, and emotional intelligence, often at the expense of solitary mastery. Boys disengage early, sensing misalignment. Many leave formal pathways altogether, opting instead for online learning, apprenticeships, or self directed skill acquisition. These routes are effective but uncredentialed, making them invisible to institutions that track success through degrees. This invisibility fuels misinterpretation. Policymakers see disengagement where adaptation exists. Media reports crisis where transformation is underway. The mismatch between perception and reality widens distrust. Men stop explaining themselves. Silence becomes efficient. Digital communities fill the gap left by physical withdrawal. Forums, private groups, and niche platforms allow men to share knowledge, humor, and support without exposure. These spaces develop their own norms and hierarchies. They are not utopian, but they are functional. Participation is voluntary, exit is easy. Accountability is enforced through reputation rather than regulation. Women often perceive these spaces as exclusionary. From the inside, they are simply focused. They exist because mainstream platforms no longer feel neutral. When moderation becomes unpredictable and norms shift rapidly, specialized environments offer stability. Again, this is not hostility, it is selection. As technology lowers the cost of exit from traditional systems, pressure mounts on those systems to justify participation. Many fail to do so. They rely on moral appeals rather than material incentives. They frame disengagement as a problem to be fixed rather than a signal to be interpreted. And the result is escalating tension between narrative and behavior. Public discourse emphasizes inclusion, while private behavior trends toward separation. Institutions celebrate diversity while participation narrows. This contradiction erodes credibility. Artificial intelligence also reshapes expectations around productivity and value. As automation replaces routine labor, value concentrates in design, oversight, and adaptation. Men who have already detached from identity based work find it easier to pivot. Women whose socialization often emphasize stability within existing systems face steeper learning curves. This is not a matter of ability, it is a matter of orientation. As economic uncertainty grows, risk tolerance diverges further. Men, unburdened by family obligations, take calculated risks in emerging fields. Women, often carrying greater caregiving responsibilities, prioritize security. These choices reinforce existing divides. Each group adapts rationally within its constraints. The cultural response to this divergence is often moralized. Men are accused of abandoning responsibility. Women are accused of entitlement. These accusations miss the point. Responsibility to what and entitlement to what are questions that assume shared premises. Those premises no longer exist. Without shared premises, dialogue collapses. Conversations turn into parallel monologues. Each side speaks within its own framework, convinced the other is acting irrationally. In reality, both are responding logically to different incentive structures. Attempts to legislate intimacy or enforce participation through policy are likely to fail. You cannot mandate trust. You cannot regulate desire into existence. You cannot coerce people into forming bonds that expose them to disproportionate risk. History offers no successful examples of such efforts. What remains is adaptation. Men adapt by minimizing exposure and maximizing autonomy. Women adapt by seeking stability through institutions and networks. These adaptations are not coordinated, which leads to friction, but they are consistent. Over time, new social norms emerge, male independence becomes expected, female self sufficiency becomes necessary, partnership becomes optional rather than assumed. This redefinition alters everything from housing design to urban planning. Smaller living spaces proliferate, flexible arrangements replace permanent ones. Mobility becomes more valuable than rootedness. Children raised in this environment internalize different expectations. They see fewer examples of enduring partnership. They learn to prioritize self reliance. Emotional bonds become conditional rather than foundational. This is not inherently negative, but it represents a profound cultural shift. The danger lies in failing to recognize the permanence of this transition. Many still treat current trends as temporary disruptions. They expect a return to previous norms once economic or political conditions stabilize. This expectation delays necessary adaptation. Stability will not restore old incentives. Even if material conditions improve, trust deficits remain. Once people learn they can live without certain systems, convincing them to return requires more than improvement. It requires transformation. It is important to examine what happens when institutions finally attempt to intervene, because this is where intentions and outcomes diverge most sharply. When policymakers, educators, corporations, and cultural leaders recognize that participation is declining, their instinct is to restore engagement through incentives, regulations, or messaging. Yet these interventions often rest on assumptions that no longer hold. They assume people want to participate but lack opportunity, when in reality, many have consciously chosen not to. Policy responses often focus on correcting perceived imbalances rather than addressing underlying trust deficits. Subsidies are offered, quotas are discussed, campaigns emphasize responsibility, inclusion, and shared values. But these measures tend to increase scrutiny and complexity rather than reduce risk. For men who have already disengaged, this reinforces the perception that participation invites oversight without protection. And in workplace settings, for example, attempts to regulate interpersonal behavior more tightly are framed as safety measures. But each additional rule increases ambiguity rather than clarity. Men respond not by learning the rules more carefully, but by avoiding situations where rules apply. Meetings become transactional, mentorship disappears, informal collaboration declines. The organization may appear compliant on paper, but its internal culture becomes brittle. Educational institutions follow a similar pattern. Programs designed to encourage male engagement often emphasize emotional expression, group participation, and social accountability. These are presented as universal goods, but they are not universally motivating. Boys who thrive in solitary mastery or competitive environments feel further alienated, dropout rates increase. Alternative pathways proliferate outside formal systems. Media interventions fare no better. Campaigns encouraging men to return to dating, to be vulnerable, or to embrace partnership often rely on moral framing. They appeal to duty, empathy, or nostalgia. But moral appeals only work when recipients accept the moral authority of the messenger. Many men no longer do. They have disengaged not because they are unaware of expectations, but because they reject the premise that meeting those expectations benefits them. Attempts to shame or ridicule disengagement backfire most dramatically. Labeling men as immature, fearful, or antisocial confirms their decision to withdraw. It signals that participation entails not only risk but contempt. Withdrawal becomes self defense. At the same time, some interventions attempt to coerce engagement indirectly by increasing dependence. Rising living costs, restricted housing options, and limited access to services are expected to push people back into shared arrangements, but men adapt by lowering needs. They choose smaller spaces, shared housing with other men, or relocation to lower cost regions. Coercion fails because exit remains cheaper than compliance. The state often assumes it can replace informal support structures indefinitely. Social programs expand to fill gaps left by declining families. Initially, this appears to work. But as tax bases shrink and demand grows, sustainability becomes an issue. Men who have disengaged from consumption and high income careers contribute less revenue. Women who rely more heavily on services increase demand. The imbalance widens. This fiscal strain leads to policy tightening. Eligibility requirements increase. Benefits are reduced. Public trust erodes further. Each cut reinforces the perception that institutional support is unreliable. Those who can exit do so. Those who cannot feel trapped. Resentment grows. Cultural discourse becomes increasingly polarized. Each side interprets the same data through different lenses. Declining marriage rates are framed as liberation or crisis, depending on perspective. Rising male solitude is framed as empowerment or pathology. Without shared definitions, dialogue stagnates. In this environment, grassroots adaptation outpaces top down intervention. Men form cooperative living arrangements, share resources, and support one another informally. These networks are resilient precisely because they are voluntary. They do not promise equality, they promise reliability. That distinction matters. Women, meanwhile, increasingly rely on formal credentials and institutional pathways to secure stability. Education becomes both shield and burden. Degrees promise security but deliver debt. Careers offer independence but demand conformity. When institutions falter, the cost is felt immediately, and as these patterns persist, social mobility slows. Not because opportunity disappears entirely, but because pathways narrow. Those who fit institutional molds advance, those who do not exit. Over time, this produces stratification within genders as well as between them. A small elite remains highly engaged. The majority operates outside formal systems. This stratification has political consequences. Engaged elites shape policy. Disengaged majorities withdraw consent quietly. Legitimacy erodes. Systems function, but they are hollow. Compliance replaces commitment. The international comparison becomes unavoidable. Countries that adapt incentives more flexibly retain higher engagement. Those that double down on control see faster withdrawal. Mobility allows comparison in real time. People observe outcomes elsewhere and adjust accordingly. For men, the lesson is clear. Participation must be optional, not compulsory. Risk must be bounded, not open ended. Contribution must be acknowledged, not presumed. Until systems reflect these principles, disengagement remains rational. For women, the challenge is different. Navigating independence in systems that are increasingly strained requires resilience and adaptation. Expectations shaped by past norms must be recalibrated. Institutional support cannot substitute indefinitely for interpersonal cooperation. The tragedy is that both sides lose from prolonged separation. Innovation slows without diverse collaboration. Communities weaken without shared investment. Loneliness increases despite connectivity. Yet no side feels able to move first without assurance the other will reciprocate. This stalemate defines the current moment. It is not explosive, it is stagnant. And stagnation is difficult to reverse because it lacks urgency. Things continue, but at lower energy. Decline feels gradual rather than catastrophic. Breaking the stalemate would require redesigning incentives from the ground up. It would require acknowledging that trust cannot be mandated and that participation must be earned through fairness. It would require reducing ambiguity rather than increasing oversight. It would require shared accountability rather than asymmetric risk. So far, few institutions show willingness to attempt such reforms. They are politically risky. They challenge entrenched narratives. They require admitting past mistakes, easier to manage decline than to confront causes. As a result, adaptation continues at the individual level. Men refine withdrawal strategies. Women refine institutional navigation strategies. The gap persists. When people withdraw from systems, they do not stop being shaped by them. Instead, they redefine themselves in opposition to expectations they no longer accept. This is where many observers misunderstand what is happening. They assume disengagement reflects confusion, resentment, or immaturity. In reality, it reflects a recalibration of self concept. For men, prolonged disengagement reshapes masculinity away from external validation and toward internal stability. Status, approval, and social recognition lose importance compared to autonomy, peace, and predictability. Masculinity becomes less performative and more utilitarian. A good life is no longer defined by milestones like marriage, career prestige, or social visibility. It is defined by low stress, self sufficiency, and freedom of movement. This shift is quiet but profound. This new masculine identity is difficult for institutions to engage because it does not seek recognition. Men who adopt it do not demand representation or advocacy, they simply opt out. They do not argue for reform, they build parallel lives. This makes them politically invisible but socially consequential. Systems feel their absence long before they hear their voice. Femininity undergoes its own transformation under these conditions. Traditional expectations of partnership, shared provision, and long term security collide with the reality of reduced male participation. Women are encouraged to embody independence and resilience, yet many still desire relational stability. This creates internal tension. Identity becomes fragmented between cultural messaging and lived experience. In response, some women double down on institutional alignment, education, career advancement, and social advocacy become central to identity. Others retreat into smaller social circles or delay life decisions in hopes conditions will change. Both strategies reflect adaptation rather than failure, but they also reflect constraint. Options narrow as systems strain. The distance between these evolving identities makes reconciliation harder. Appeals to shared values lose traction when values diverge. Men prioritize autonomy. Women prioritize security. Neither priority is illegitimate, but they are not easily reconciled without structural support that no longer exists. Attempts to bridge this gap through identity based campaigns often fail because they misdiagnose the problem. Encouraging men to embrace vulnerability does not address risk asymmetry. Encouraging women to lower expectations does not address structural instability. Identity appeals cannot substitute for material incentives. As disengagement persists, new forms of partnership may emerge, but they will not resemble traditional models. They will likely be contractual, limited in scope, and flexible in duration. Expectations will be explicit, exit conditions will be defined, emotional investment will be cautious. These arrangements may lack romance, but they offer predictability. Some will view this as bleak, others will view it as honest. What matters is that it reflects the environment people are responding to. When trust is scarce, clarity becomes valuable. When permanence is risky, flexibility becomes attractive. Community structures will also adapt. Smaller interest based groups will replace broad social networks. Loyalty will be personal rather than institutional. Reputation will matter more than credentials. These communities will be resilient but insular. They will provide support to members while remaining indifferent to outsiders. This insularity raises concerns about fragmentation, but it is a logical response to uncertainty. People invest where returns are reliable. Large systems struggle to offer that reliability when participation is uneven and trust is low. The long term consequences of this shift are still unfolding. Some outcomes may be positive: reduced conflict, greater individual autonomy, more honest relationships. Others may be negative: declining birth rates, weaker social cohesion, increased loneliness. Both sets of outcomes can coexist. What is clear is that this is not a temporary phase. It is a structural adjustment driven by rational behavior under changing conditions. Waiting for a return to previous norms without addressing why they collapsed is unrealistic. If reconciliation is possible, it will not come from moral pressure or nostalgic appeals. It will come from redesigning systems so that participation is genuinely rewarding and risks are shared fairly. It will require transparency, accountability, and mutual respect grounded in reality rather than ideology. That process has barely begun. Until it does, withdrawal will remain the default strategy for many, not because people reject connection, but because they reject exposure without protection. As we close this discussion, it is important to reflect personally. Look at your own environment. Observe how people interact or do not. Notice where engagement has faded and where new patterns have emerged. These are not isolated incidents, they are signals of a broader realignment. I want to hear from you. What did you think about what was discussed here? Do you agree with the direction things are moving? Are you seeing similar patterns in your own life or among people you know? Leave a comment and share your thoughts, because these conversations matter and they shape how we understand the world we are living in. Like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.